I am Laurens van Es, and I have the privilege of teaching at SSU, and I also have the privilege of welcoming Mark today, as well as you all. Before we start, I would like to ask you to take a moment to reflect on the land that you are sitting on or standing on right now. Who are the people who are indigenous to that land? What is their relationship to that land, and what is your relationship to them? How does your life honor those relationships? As we ground ourselves in the land and its true history, we may find ourselves better able to walk a path of peace, truth, and reconciliation. We gather online today as people from many different places. St. Stephen's University is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Pescadumagadi people, covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship. We are grateful for their welcome and their friendship. The mission of SSU, of St. Stephen's University, is to prepare people through academic, personal, and spiritual development for a life of justice, beauty, and compassion, enabling a humble, creative engagement with their world. In light of that mission, and in light of current events here in North America, as well as in Palestine and Israel, it is very fitting that we have as our special guest today Mark Braverman. Dr. Braverman's roots are in the Holy Land. His grandfather, a fifth-generation Palestinian Jew, was born in Jerusalem, emigrating to the US as a young man. Growing up in the United States, Mark was reared in the Jewish tradition, studying Bible, Hebrew literature, and Jewish history. Having devoted his professional career to working with groups and individuals undergoing traumatic stress, Mark's return to the Holy Land in 2006 proved transformative. After witnessing the occupation of Palestine, and by encounters with peace activists and civil societies from the Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities, Mark has devoted himself full-time to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Many of you will know him as co-founder of the Friends of Tenth of Nations North America, or from his work on the Committee of Friends of Seville North America. Mark has been closely involved in the growth of the international church movement to support the cause of Palestinian rights. He is program director for Kairos USA, a movement to unify and mobilize American Christians to take a prophetic stance for a just peace in Israel and Palestine. Friends, we find ourselves in a time where taking a hard look at the traditions that continue to inspire and shape us seems especially urgent. I am grateful that we have Mark to guide us in that task today. Please listen with an open mind and a generous heart. Mark, thank you again for being willing to speak with us today. I'm handing it over to you now.
I want to say how pleased I am to be connected now with St. Stephen's. I'm very excited about this connection and about having a chance to interact with all of you. I hope today is not too much of a fire hose experience. When this opportunity came up and this request came, it was unexpected, and for the past few weeks, I've been really engrossed, maybe even obsessed with what has come up for me in trying to unpack this issue. A couple of housekeeping things. Right now, I'm looking right at you, and I'm speaking right to you. You will notice during some of the time that I will look down, and it looks like I'm reading because I will be. If I don't resort to that, it's not going to go well because I will just talk and become discursive, and we'll never get through the material. So I don't like looking down and reading, but I am going to be doing that some of the time. The other thing is that I've developed a cough. We're working on it with the doctors to try to figure out the origin of it. I'm not sick. It's not infectious. It's a little bit of a mystery, and it comes and goes. So if I do have to cough, I'm just explaining that and hope there won't be too disruptive, folks. This is the timing of today is, I suppose, apt. It's a very stressful, very upsetting day for us here in the United States. So, by the way, I'm speaking to you from Washington State, the northwestern corner of the continent of the United States. I'm on the ancestral lands of the Chimacun the Skalim, the Snohomish, and the Makar. And I acknowledge that I'm on their land. In fact, I'm on a small homestead with my wife, several animals, together with my son and son-in-law, in creating our own homestead, our own answer to climate change. So just a bit of background for me. I was born in the United States to a really traditional Jewish family. When in middle age, I finally visited the enemy that I was taught to hate and fear, the Palestinian people, or the Arabs as we call them. It absolutely changed my life. I had left the synagogue, even though I'd been raised and steeped in Jewish tradition, because of something that I didn't quite understand. But when I went to Israel and went across that border, that wall, and met the Palestinian people, I understood why it was that I had been so alienated from my own people and my own tradition. And the short story is that meeting the Palestinians, in particular the Palestinian Christians, involved in a powerful culture of resistance to occupation and to colonization. I really discovered my Jewishness, and I was introduced to really the best Jew of all time, so Jesus of Nazareth, who made me understand what my true Jewish core was about. And I'll have a chance to talk a bit about that. When I came back to the United States after that experience, I started speaking a lot of churches. And the rest of the Bible was open to me, the New Testament, the Gospels, that whole narrative, the ministry of Jesus. And I warmed to it and started to give sermons and preach from church, in churches on Sunday mornings. And people would come up to me afterwards and say, "You really seem to get Christianity and Jesus. When did you convert?" And my answer finally became, I don't really know what that would mean. I remain a Jew. And I only wish that things had gone differently in the first century so that I wouldn't have to be answering that question. So the whole issue of the rift, the split between the Jews who were followers of Jesus and the Jews who, in my sense, in some ways stayed behind, and followers of Jesus who went off to found a new religion, which is not what Jesus had intended at all, I think is at the root and it's the origin of what became church anti-Semitism. And I think the answer lies in somehow healing that rift, but I don't think in ways that it's manifesting now. Anti-Semitism is deeply entrenched in Western civilization. It's an integral, a key part of church history from its beginning. And it's very much alive today, which is why the current heated controversy is so important to understand about anti-Semitism. The heat and controversy is about what has been termed the weaponization of anti-Semitism, which is a very apt word. It's been weaponized to silence mounting opposition to the state of Israel's genocidal and colonial program against the Palestinian people. It's important to understand this, not only for the sake of the Palestinians, but for the sake of the Jews, who do need to be defended against anti-Semitism, the real anti-Semitism, and also who need to be rescued from their suicidal, criminal, and soul-killing project of ethnic nationalism. I say this as a Jew with enormous sadness, feel really strongly about it. But also for the sake of the church, we have to understand anti-Semitism as it is manifested today, because the church stands at a Kairos, a critical challenge to itself. As the South African anti-apartheid church leaders and theologians put it, Kairos is a moment of grace and opportunity when God issues a challenge for decisive action. So that's what the question of anti-Semitism today opens us up to. This is what, when we unpack it, presents to us a moment of truth, not only about one particular struggle of one particular people against oppression and tyranny, but a crisis that threatens the continuity of humankind and the planet as we know it, the precious, mysterious, astonishing gifts of creation itself. So I'm speaking to you from the United States. You all know what's happening here in my country today. And it has huge consequences, not only for United States citizens, but for the world. So this is much bigger. The anti-Semitism question is a piece of a much, much, much bigger question and issue. And that's what I'm going to try to do in the short time that we have today. So this is a phrase that, as far as I know, was coined by a country of yours, Stefan, John DeGruchy. If you don't know John's work, just look it up, DeGruchy, John W. DeGruchy. And he talked about what he called the triumphalist heresy. I was reading just a homily of his, and he quotes from this passage in Matthew. And it talks about what is the lordship of Jesus. Okay? So Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew says, you can cry, Lord, Lord, but only those who will do the will of the Father will enter the kingdom of heaven, or I would prefer to say would help create the kingdom of heaven here on earth. So there are two ways to think about the lordship of Jesus. Take a good look at this bas-relief here. You see a man on a horse grasping his sword, and he's looking up to a sword in the sky. Now, we all know what this is. This is 4th century. This is the Emperor Constantine. You know what's written on the sword, which is, it says, in this place conquer, or with this conquer. So Constantine isn't quite sure what to make of this. It looks like a sword. Is it the same as the sword that's at my side? What am I supposed to conquer? What lord here are we talking about? It was really quite a momentous moment in church history, because what it meant was that, and this is the triumphalist heresy, that the church turned its back on the gospel. It turned its back on Jesus in the most egregious, fundamental way, in an embrace of, a joining with, a top-down hierarchical power, the structure of Rome, a betrayal of the vision of community based on compassion and servanthood, a rejection of the poor and the weak, and the caring for the most vulnerable. Yes, we are going to get to anti-Semitism. Theology, thus, became the handmaiden of the dominant racial group. So, when Paul said we must confess Jesus as Lord, he was referring to the followers of Jesus who were being persecuted. Right? Why? Because they were saying Jesus is Lord and not Caesar. And this has been the struggle, the internal struggle of the church from its beginning. You can say that the church was born in this struggle between empire and prophecy, between community and tyranny. That's why I think this picture of Constantine is so important. And I'd like to think that he's already questioning what this all means. What Constantine did and what the church did is very, very clear. At which point, the church, which began as a grassroots community of dissidents who were opposing or trying to create an alternative to the Roman Empire that they lived in the heart of, and that community, grassroots-based resistance movement, became Christendom. So, what's the cross? There's a theology of the cross, and we know what that means. And then there is this, right? And next slide, please. what we got was, now this is interesting. When you go to Google Images, you turn up all kinds of stuff. So you plug in Crusades, and you get this picture on the left, which is weird, right? You've got these crusaders walking through the streets of Old Jerusalem, and that's the Western Wall on the right. That's the remains of Solomon's Temple, which is a shrine to the Jews, and which has its own history, including 1967, when the state of Israel took military control over East Jerusalem. And these are parallel pictures. You have 11th century crusaders occupying Jerusalem and making it into their shrine of military power and empire. And you've got the Jewish state of Israel doing the same thing 1,000 years later. I just want to sort of bookmark that for us, because it becomes very, very important for our discussion. If you Google "destroy this temple," okay, of course, this is like from Matthew and from John 2, and you get all kinds of weird stuff when you ask Google Images to give you this. This is the closest I could get. And it's not bad. Jesus is, at least he doesn't have blue eyes and blonde hair, but okay, we'll take it. This is Jesus. And you have the apostles who are puzzled and clueless, which is also quite perfect. This, of course, is Palm Sunday. Jesus goes, after riding in on the donkey, he goes straight to the temple, and he says, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days." Now, if you go to the Greek, destroy is not a really good word, because it's not a good translation of the word lusate, which means loosen this temple, break it apart, take away its power, and let it turn into something else. So raise it up does not mean rebuild it, which is what the apostles thought. Raise it up means turn it into something else. And the author of John, to make sure that we get it right, says he was speaking of the temple of his body. So that the edifice of the temple, this symbol, not only of Roman power, but of the complicity of the Jewish theocracy of the time, turns into the body of Christ. One united humanity, one single body of humanity, united in compassion and love. That's the struggle. That's why I identify so strongly with Jesus, because this is the Jewish struggle today as well. What do we do? Okay, just a quick trip through what the Constantinian moment produced. Right? There was the Crusades. That was the first. Okay. Then we get to 1493 and the doctrine of discovery. It's a papal bull called interconnectedness, which literally means you can take all these lands anywhere in the world for Rome and God and country and Jesus, and anything else. It's like etc. means and other things. Intercetera means and anything else that you find. It's all ours. So the doctrine of discovery, of course, is the beginning of colonialism. The church is deeply, deeply implicated in this. Here's some nice pictures of this. I mean, again, Google Images will give you lots and lots of stuff. I thought these were pretty representative. On the left, you've got the Spanish and Portuguese and what have you, claiming these new territories. And then this is a very American piece of iconography. This is, of course, with the Western expansion of the Anglo-American colonists in what is now the United States, and probably at that point Canada as well. I like to think that if you take a look, I don't know if I have a pointer here. Can you see this? Probably not. But the figures on the left, I think the artist may have meant them to be more pioneers, but the way they're sort of, I'd like to to think that if you were able to really zoom in on this low quality image, that this looks like the indigenous peoples who are being pushed before them. And of course, the whole idea of manifest destiny, a shining city on the hill, you've got this, this angelic white figure leading them on. Again, very, very theological, very biblically based. And of course, when I was brought up, we talked about slavery as America's original sin. That's not America's original sin. America's original sin we have in the previous slide, which is the conquest and the genocide, and the dispossession of the indigenous peoples, the theft of the land. The slave trade and chattel slavery was a secondary sin, because who was going to now exploit that land, farm it, grow the stuff, send the cotton to England, harvest the sugar from Jamaica, all of that. That's a secondary sin. But then this all comes from the doctrine of discovery. It all goes back to constant. Okay, so let's move on here. What's the relationship to church anti-Judaism? If you're going to have an empire and you're going to consolidate your power, you need to have an enemy. The Jews were the very convenient target for that. I don't know if I included slides here of some of the other classic Jewish or anti-Jewish memes. I don't want to inflict medieval art showing babies being bled to death to get their blood to make matzahs. I didn't want to inflict that on you. The deicide charge, go back to the verses in Matthew and John. You know those verses, you know those difficult texts. And I'm still puzzling over basically how the deicide charge really caught on. But it was very, very, very convenient to throw the Jews under the bus, to make Jesus into a martyr and to secularize him in a way that would then create an enemy of the Jews who were responsible for crucifixion and martyrdom, etc. But it morphed into a very, very toxic, scary, ugly form of anti-Judaism. Some of you may be familiar with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which talks about a Jewish conspiracy to control the world. It's fairly familiar. This was mostly late 18th century, early 19th century stuff in Europe. The picture on the left is Nazi propaganda. It's the infamous stab in the back myth. That's the shame and the humiliation of defeat in World War I was the result of the Jews. And they were stabbing in the back the German soldiers. And they were responsible for Germany's defeat. That was just one piece of a lot of the anti-Jewish stuff that was going around. And then you have the Nuremberg laws, and the sign says, "Kauf nicht bei Juden," do not buy from Jews. And that was the beginning of the genocide of the Jews of Europe. Kauf nicht bei Juden is an interesting thing to think about. We won't have time to talk about it, but it is used in the weaponization of anti-Semitism when people talking about a boycott of Israel are then accused of being just like the Nazis who boycotted Jewish businesses. And if we're now boycotting Jews, we're being just like the Nazis, which of course is a complete, utter, and obscene distortion of what the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is a nonviolent movement of Palestinians, is really about. Couldn't be more different. Let's talk about post-Holocaust theology. Post-Holocaust theology is both Christian and Jewish. It was and I want to talk about the Christian post-Holocaust theology for Jews was an attempt to deal with the trauma of the genocide and to understand. It was a theodicy question. How could God have allowed this to happen? If God loves us so much, why were we punished in this way? Fairly understandable and classic theological discourse. Post-Holocaust theology for Christians was a reaction to the shame and horror of the Nazi genocide. I like to think about it sort of metaphorically. The Christians, mostly Protestants, in post-war Germany stood before the ovens and said, "What have we done?" And they were right. This was a product of centuries, almost millennia, of church Christian anti-Semitism, had produced this horror, this incredible sin. It was an opportunity to take Christendom and Christians to look at themselves critically about what was this about us that allowed us to do this. But you sort of failed at that. You took a shortcut. And the shortcut was, we can, I won't say wash our hands of, but expiate and atone for our sin by elevating Jews, turning the demonization of the Jews upside down. And instead of demonizing Jews and denigrating Jews, saying that we sinned against the Jews because we did that, and we need to now embrace the Jews. And we need to, even more importantly, embrace their project of ethnic nationalism and being able to create their own safe haven and homeland, just like other people. Zionism was born at the end of the 19th century, where ethnic nationalism was really the zeitgeist, and Jews said, "Well, we want that. We want that too." And there's a lot of anti-Semitism in this, because Christian Zionism really was a way to think about Jews as special, to say, let's send them over there. In the meantime, we get rid of them. But mostly it was a guilt offering. And it was really a mistake and a secondary sin on the part of Christians to embrace the Jewish mistake of thinking that the answer to anti-Semitism was ethnic nationalism. It's not the trajectory of history. It's not where we need to be going. But that's where the Jews went. So that's why I call it the slippery slope to Zionism. I've done a lot of writing about that. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, and I'll spend a little bit of time on this because I think it's the key to unlock the understanding of how Zionism has now been weaponized and how wrong the weaponization of Zionism is. This is a fellow named Franklin Littell. He was a Methodist pastor and theologian in the United States. And he spent a fair amount of time in Europe right after the war, went to the death camps, I think was really traumatized by that as well, and just became consumed with this desire to find a way to heal the rift and to reconnect with the Jewish people. And he was part of a huge theological revisionism on the part of mainline Protestant theology. I mean, yes, the Catholics came along a bit later with Vatican II, but really it was a mainline Protestant effort to purge Christianity of its toxic anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And supersessionism thus becomes the Christian sin. The idea that the church came to replace the Jewish people, that the New Testament came to replace and displace and really didn't renounce the Old Testament, New Testament love, compassion, goodness, Old Testament legalism, and vengeful, destructive, violent, militaristic God. Yes, it's all there. But there was a sense of apologizing for what the New Testament and what Jesus had actually brought. And when I first heard about supersessionism, I was first getting to know what Christianity was about. In middle age, when I was doing all this work with the church, I said, "Well, explain it to me." And he said, "Well, the idea was that Christianity brought something new." I said, "Well, that sounds right to me." In fact, I saw Jesus as a radical Jewish reformer, and his target was quite appropriately corruption and turning its back on all that was good in the New Testament, in the Old Testament. So why are you Christians being so apologetic about that? Well, because it turned into the deicide charge and it caused all this bad stuff. I said, yes, that's true. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, folks. But what we're seeing here with this, and he's very representative of, I think, the way most people in my generation and the next generation, Christian theologians and pastors, were raised in this intensely philo-Judaic apologetic theology. So Judaism and the Jewish people are sacralized. It becomes kind of an idolatry. And I think it's very problematic, precisely because today, and we'll talk about this in a bit, the church is really challenged to take a prophetic stance with respect to Palestine, which opens up, it's much bigger than Palestine. But just speaking about Palestine, Christians feel like they're theologically and politically, historically, sociologically, their heads have been tied behind their backs, because to speak out against the state of Israel, the Jewish state, we created that rule by calling the Jewish state Israel, confusing it with biblical Israel and all that, is to be anti-Semitic. After all that we, the Christians, have done against the Jews, to criticize Israel. So that's why it's really important to take this on and to get over this penitential project. So the focus, the project, the intensely driven desire to find a way to reconcile with the Jewish people, I think, has really taken mainline Christian theology captive and has handicapped it. And it's the root of what has happened to the fight against anti-Semitism today. It's distorted it. It's all fed in to this project to earn our way back. I think it's a real problem. Again, just take a minute to read this. Does this make sense to you? As Christians, as people who are studying theology, who are preparing to be pastors or to work in the community, as people who claim to follow the ministry of Jesus Christ and the fundamental precepts of the gospel, doesn't make sense to me. Christians cannot establish a self-identity except in relation to the Jewish people. The Jewish people today, the Jewish people today, we are and we have to work this out. We have to figure out a way to understand our mistake, the catastrophic mistake we made, which has resulted in what you see today, it was the end game all along, from the beginning of the Zionist project, when it was taken over by the ethnic nationalists and became a project of colonialism and ethnic cleansing. What we see today in Israel today, which is a fantastic major proportions, it was all built in. It had to end that way. That's where it was going. So Christians want to establish a self-identity. They have to be really good. And if it's really about loving the Jewish people, which I think it isn't, but if it's really about loving the Jewish people, you tell them to stop. You don't enable it. And then finally, Paul Van Buren, you may have heard of him. He's an Episcopalian. He died, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. And he really was one of the premier post-Holocaust theologians. And just take a look at this second paragraph. The Israeli Defense Force sweeping over Sinai and retaking East Jerusalem. So we're back in the Bible, aren't we? We've received the Ten Commandments from Sinai, and then we go off to conquer Jerusalem. It's very, very biblical. It's very dangerous because that's the Bible that's being used to colonize the Palestinian people and take Palestinian lands, just like Paul's epistles were used to colonize North America. It's the same stuff. And yet, this has become part of the mainstream of Protestant Christian theology.
All right, thank you, Mark. We want to create a little space for people to ask questions. If you have any, feel free to write them in the chat, or if you want to call in a question, you can do that too by clicking the call in question button at the bottom of your screen, and I can let you into the call that way. Here's the question. Maybe to start. It says, I hope this question will eventually be answered throughout the session. And he says, I'm feeling a bit confused about how we as Christians are to think about our faith in relationship to Judaism. The link is important. Yes. So can you speak a bit maybe to what is this relationship with Judaism, with Jewish history, with the place that Christians play, the role that Judaism in Jewish history plays?
Christians have had a lot of different ways of understanding the link with Judaism. One is to see the Old Testament as a proof text and kind of a prophecy for the appearance of Jesus. And, you take a look at the Gospels and Acts, it shows a direct line from King David to Jesus, a genealogy. I mean, it's fairly transparent that to establish that link. It was a link that I think, again, in the Gospels is very confusing. So Jesus is supposed to be the new king. That's what Messiah means, right? The anointed one, the second king, Prince of Peace. A lot of the names that were used for him are the names, I think, on purpose that were also used for Caesar to say, no, not that king, but this king. Jesus is going to be king. And so, in advance of Pentecost, the apostles say, well, Jesus says, go to Jerusalem and you'll receive the power of the Holy Spirit. And what do they ask him? They said, Lord, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Right? Now, they were talking about king, temple, army, walls, national sovereignty. We're going to get it back, right? Jesus just said, just go to Jerusalem and you'll find out what that power is. And of course, it's nothing like that. The power is they're knocked to their feet. They stand up, speaking all the languages of the known world, and they're listed. And Jesus says, okay, now get out of here, go to Jerusalem, and then go to the far corners of the known world and bring the good news that this is for everybody. The old order is over. Everything that was represented by the temple, everything that was represented by the idea that we are land-based. Jesus' little speech to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well, where she says, why are you talking to me? I'm a Samaritan. I worship on this mountain. You worship on that mountain. Remember what Jesus said to her, right? He said, woman, time will come when we will not worship on this mountain or that mountain, but in the Spirit. So the whole idea of Jesus as king, in fact, it's kind of a head fake. No, you need to really understand differently what it means what kingship and lordship really means. He was deconstructing the whole thing. So I think that mostly Christians are not brought up to think that way. They're brought up to think that Jesus is the culmination of history, which is a big mistake. I mean, that's what the early church fathers said. Eusebius, who basically was a chum of Constantine, said, oh, this is great. The fact that the Roman Empire, which is the culmination of history, is embracing Christianity as the true faith, means that Christianity, like Rome, is the end of history, or is the culmination of history. Total distortion and misunderstanding of the Gospels and of Jesus' ministry. So that's my understanding of what Christianity is and what the ministry of Jesus was all about, and the gospel message. Now, it's conditioned. I was set up for this because I was so horrified. But what I saw was a result of Jewish exceptionalism. That we are the best, that by way not of our victory, but of our victimhood, we then become entitled to and privileged to do whatever we want to take care of ourselves. So exceptionalism is the great evil for Jews, for Christians, for Muslims, for Hindus. Always bad. That's the link. And I would just conclude by saying Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who also had his mind blown by his own crisis, at the end of his life in prison, was writing to his friend Eberhard Bethge. John DeGrucci, by the way, has done a lot of writing about it, and said, you know what? I think we need a religionless Christianity. We've come to the end of what religion can do and should do, because he saw what happened when religion is merged with nationalism, which is exactly where the Lutheran Church in Germany was. And Bonhoeffer grew up and believed that. They were totally merged. And that's what Jesus was blowing apart. So, long answer. I hope it begins to answer your question. Great question.
Yeah, we have another question here from Virginia. The question is, Mark, in your experience, what have you seen to be most effective in the transformation of Christian Zionists and Zionists or ethno-nationalists in general? In other words, how do you personally think we can best help those suffering under those ideologies?
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. Great question. And I wish we had time to talk more about Christian Zionism. If we had more time, there would be a whole other section in this webinar. It's extremely important question. Okay, so the first thing we need to understand about Christian Zionism is that there's a spectrum here. We can't generalize about it. We tend to think about Christian Zionism as very conservative, literalist, Bible-based, crazy, radical, nutcase, right-wing, ugly, fundamentalist belief, totally unbiblical, by the way, that and very eschatological, that the day that the last non-Jew is cleansed from Jerusalem, Jesus is going to come back the next day, right? And then you have the end times, you have the dispensations, all of that garbage. And it is, and it's dangerous, and it's powerful, and those Christian Zionists are totally in cahoots with neoconservatives here in the United States and with the state of Israel. Totally true. Bad stuff. So it's the worst you can see in terms of how religion in the Bible can be distorted and used for nefarious purposes, which we'll get to when we talk in the next section about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. But you've got what I like to call kind of a kindler, gentler, liberal Christian Zionism hiding in plain sight in mainline Christianity. And it's this kind of thing that you saw when we talked about Littell and Van Buren. I mean, they're Christian Zionists, for sure. They are glorifying and lionizing the state of Israel. This is a wonderful thing. Now, they're not saying it's a wonderful thing because it's going to bring on the end times. They don't believe in the end times. They say it's a wonderful thing because, first of all, it makes us feel we're comfortable with it as Christians who feel guilty as hell about having kicked the Jews around for 2,000 years. So we feel better. It also is very, very much part of a neoliberal consciousness, which says these are nice Jews, and by that they mean part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is something else we can talk about, very Christian Zionist concept, where these white Europeans have colonized these brown people who worship another religion and worship a different God and all of that. And this seems great to us. It's white, capital W, Eurocentric exceptionalism. It's whiteness in that sense of capital W whiteness. And I think Christian Zionism participates in that. Now, Frank Littell and Paul Van Buren were probably really nice guys. But they had no consciousness of the implications of what Zionism really is, whether it be Christian or Jewish. So I do a lot of work with Palestinian Christians now, and there's a lot of wonderful theology coming out. Again, a whole other course, a whole other webinar to talk about. Many of you are familiar with Moshe Isaac's work, Naim Atik's work, Dmitry Raheb's work. And there's a wonderful theology that has come out of this. And Christian Zionism has become, we discovered this over the past years, if we really want to educate people and to make inroads and to do something about this toxic theology, we have to take on Christian Zionism frontally. And I, frankly, am more concerned about the, quote, liberal, nice-sounding Christian Zionism that's hiding in the mainstream than I am about the crazy nutcase right-wing fundamentalists who aren't going to listen. That's a short answer. Well, it is a short answer to a very, very big question. But Christian Zionism is key. And I'm going to send you to a website when we get to the end. There's a slide with a bunch of websites. But just go to christianzionism.org, which is misleading in a beautiful way because people will go to it thinking they're going to learn about Christian Zionism. You're really getting sucked into being deprogrammed from Christian Zionism. It's a wonderful, wonderful website. So we're now in. Do you want to take another question, or is it time for a break?
We're going to take a 5-minute break, so just a short stretch break. So do what you need to do. Grab a cup of coffee. As we go to break, I'm going to play a short video about some of our SSU programming, and then we'll be back in about 5 minutes. So thanks for being here.
My name is Joey, and I'm from Edinburgh originally, but I live on the west coast of the States. I do a lot of organizing work with congregations and communities, and it's really hard to find space outside of busy everyday life to reflect on the bigger questions. So this program has been really important for that, and it's also connected me with other folks who care about a lot of the same things that I do. If what you're looking for is a combination of practice and practical suggestions and advice and education alongside a theoretical or a more zoomed out perspective on issues around peace and justice and theology, then this is a really good fit for you. So it feels very much to me that this program invites lots of different perspectives and helps people wrestle with peace, not just from one perspective only, but really values those many different voices. And that feels really important for this work. Yeah, from this trip in Northern Ireland for the last 2 weeks, really got a sense of lived experience of the work of peace and justice from a perspective of spiritual communities. Hear from people who have been doing this work for decades, to hear from folks who are looking at other contexts around the world and comparing those experiences of conflict, and then to be able to take that home to our own context, but also to learn some of the big picture lessons from the conflict here in Northern Ireland.
Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. If you all had a good quick break, we're just going to hand it right back to Mark to carry us on. So off to you, Mark.
Okay, so I think one of the main thrusts of what we were going to try to talk about up to now is that the thing we're really up against is Christian triumphalism, and that partly as a result of post-World War II, there's a real shift. And I think that the real challenge was for Christians to learn to dive deep and to look deep and to realize that the real problem was Christian triumphalism and exceptionalism. And that's what caused all the evils that the church was involved in, culminating in genocide. But there's a guy named Sven Lindqvist. You could look him up. He's a Swede. He just died recently. He said, you know what? Hitler did not invent genocide. So the West has been involved in genocide as part of colonialism for centuries. That's what Christians had to look at, and that's what the West had to look at. But of course, that didn't happen. And instead, what we've gotten, and Zionism is one expression of this, is what I call Judeo-Christian triumphalism, which is Christian triumphalism on steroids. Just if you want to talk about a continuity between Judaism and Christianity, what happened was that Christianity tried to sort of projected all of turned anti-Judaism on its head. So the Jews are not demons, the Jews are gods, the Jews are blessed, they're God's beloved. So let's give that back to them, and then we'll hitch a ride on it. So you have Christian Jewish triumphalism on steroids. I think that's what's happened. It's very, very much a quote, a capital W white, Eurocentric Western phenomenon. I should say, though, that, the South Africans invented this idea. Well, no, actually, it came out of the confessing church in Nazi Germany. The idea of church struggle. The church struggled against National Socialism, or the confessing church did. It struggled against itself, against its own church, and the Lutheran Church in Germany, which threw in with National Socialism, ran to embrace. And so it's that concept of the church struggle. And the South Africans had their own struggle. These church people who allied with the actual resistance movements within South Africa against apartheid, that struggle with their own churches, with their own church hierarchy. One thing that kept was the monastic movement, and St. Benedict right on through that preserved. It was an effort, a successful effort, to preserve Christianity, preserve the Gospels in the face of what had happened to the church becoming Christian. Just important to remember, it's not all black. It were the monks. It were the monastics. And that spirit is still very, very much alive. Okay. So, now, the new anti-Semitism. So, in the 70s, we have this phenomenon. What was happening in the 70s? Cold War was still on, but there also now was beginning of awareness of Israel's crimes. So a new sort of secular version of what I just talked about in terms of the mainline Christian glorification and intense violent Judaism, the whole penitential project. A secular version arose, mostly articulated by Jewish intellectuals, closely identified with the neoconservatism that arose in the late 1960s as a reaction to the protests against the Vietnam War. Right? So there was this conservative backlash against the 60s, the now generation, the hippies, the protests, the drugs, the sex, all of that. The Jews latched on to this idea of the new anti-Semitism, and the non-Jewish neocons loved it as well. And what they did was they associated the new left with this anti-Semitic movement. So they called it an anti-Semitic movement. Next slide, please. All right, just going to use some examples of this. So I remember him growing up. He was a god. We worshipped him. He was a very articulate guy. He was actually a South African in origin, and they immigrated to Israel. So, and his English was like amazing. So he became the foreign minister of Israel. He gave a lot of speeches in the UN. He gave a famous speech after the 1967 war. He weighed in on this as well. He's a great spokesman for this. This was like a 1973 speech. Recently, we have witnessed the rise of the new left. Usually it's capitalized, which identifies Israel with the establishment, never trust anybody over 30, that kind of thing. If you really are threatened by this challenge to the, quote, establishment, which is all about law and order and goodness and family, all of those traditional values, then you want to watch out for people who are taking aim at Israel. The new left is the author and progenitor of the new anti-Semitism. So you see what's happened here. They have latched onto this as part of their own neoconservative agenda. Very important to understand this. Next slide, please. And he goes on. And I have this in bold. This is all you have to remember. Anti-Zionism is merely the new anti-Semitism. Now, this was back in the 70s. But if you've been following this at all, you see that this gun has now been, magnified up 300%, and it's being brought out and rolled out, particular to the response of the protests since October 7th, 2023, and the Gaza genocide. I mean, that has threatened the, quote, establishment so horrifically that this one is being pulled out again. The conflation and the total merging between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is an old trick. It goes back to the 70s and the 60s. Jewish people, State of Israel, same thing. Zionism, Judaism, same thing. Now, I was raised on this. It goes deep, and it's been around for a while. And it still has, it's a problem not just for the Jews, but for you all. I've got a bookshelf full of this stuff. A lot of stuff was produced. This is maybe the first one and sort of the classic by Epstein and Forster, the new anti-Semitism. They actually did not coin the term, but they were right in the forefront. Now they talk about the radical left, and they really, really demonize. It's against motherhood, apple pie, all that's good. And they, and what this, quote, radical left is doing in its attempt to destroy modern civilization is taking aim at Israel and painting it with that brush. And through there, God forbid, painting the Arabs, as they call them, as the real people, third world people struggling for their independence, which of course they are, and the establishment can. It's Hollywood. So this has been around for 50 years. It's still very much with us. By the way, Columbia University is my alma mater. I was there in the 60s when these protests started. To my shame, I was not part of them. I was also threatened by it. I was really a good boy. And he's a Jewish kid. And wouldn't have any part of this radical stuff. But here we are. Now, on the left, we have a woman named Elise Stefanik. She is a revered member of our House of Representatives here, and you may have tuned into these hearings. She is grilling Dr. Claudine Gay, who was at the time, but not for long, the new president of Harvard University. And she and two other university presidents got hauled up before a congressional committee. Stefanik's a Republican. To her shame, she has stooped really low to make political capital out of this. And they're saying, what have you done to suppress and smash and end this horrible anti-Semitism? This genocidal speech calling for the death of Jews, characterizing, these protests in all kinds of ways. And Gay was totally naive. She had no idea the buzzsaw that she was walking into. And she didn't say the right things. Within, I don't know, a couple of weeks, she was gone. She wasn't president of Harvard anymore. In the meantime, though, like Galileo, she was on her knees recanting. And she wrote an editorial in the New York Times. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. Yeah, I'm not going to culpa. She, just towing the line and talking about how anti-Semitism is terrible and the worst evil, and that it has to be stamped out. So that's just one example of how anti-Semitism has been weaponized again since October 7th. Now, there's one more thing I want to tell you about here. It just came up last week. So there's this thing called the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is part of a network of radically conservative organizations who are responsible for our Supreme Court today. They are behind Trump and his minions and the disaster that has our country. The Heritage Foundation, we were in a classroom or in a theater, I'd say, raise your hands if you know what Project 2025 is. I'm sure you all know what Project 2025 is. Even our neighbors north of the border. And it is, it's an understatement to say it's scary stuff. They want to dismantle what's left of our democracy, and they might succeed. So anyway, they've spun this off. They're calling it Project Esther. Now, those of you who know your Bible and know the book of Esther know that it's a narrative, it's a made-up story, which shows how the Jews in Persia of whenever time that was managed to thwart a planned genocide of the Jews. And Esther was the queen, the Jewish queen, who spoke to the king and got him to stop it, at which point he gave permission to the Jews to go out and slaughter tens of thousands of Persians. It's a lovely little book in our codex of Old Testament texts. And of course, I grew up with it, and we thought it was wonderful. So Anyway, this is scary stuff. You can Google this, and you'll get to the Heritage Foundation. Just like Project 2025, it's right out there. Take a look at this for a moment. They're saying there is a highly organized global Hamas support network. And it's on the list of terrorist organizations. This scares me so much. Because there's a lot of power and a lot of money behind this stuff. And you see how they are shamelessly exploiting this to further their own agenda. I think we need to be very, very, very scared. Now notice that there's an absolute conflation of being anti-Israel and anti-American. It's a detriment of America's national security interests, the security and prosperity of all Americans. You see how scary and diabolical this is. And then they start to name names. American Muslims for Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, Students for Justice in Palestine. Have you got an SJP? You've got SJP chapters in Canada? I wonder. And they're going after George Soros, big target, right? And Tides, which is another very progressive organization, foundation that funds good people and good organizations. So they are going for blood, and they are powerful. We are up against very, very powerful forces here. And it's all under the flag of combating anti-Semitism. The hysteria over anti-Semitism has nothing to do with defending the Jewish people against discrimination or hatred. Defending Israel and the racist ideology and colonial intentions of Zionism represents not the liberation or safety of the Jewish people, but the central role played by the Jewish state in the neoliberal order. Think of those graphics we looked at earlier, the stab in the back meme from the Nazi era, the drawing on the cover of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion of the Jews' bloody hands grasping the globe. This is the other side of the same coin. Again, in the dreadful irony, the Jew here has been singled out, made special, different. I'm talking about the defense, the purported defense of the Jews against anti-Semitism. It singles us out as special and different. It's the same as those memes of the Jewish conspiracy. And the ugly, hook-nosed Jew was sucking the blood out of the good white Christian world. Right? So, and the most important and serious thing of all, it grants the Jews huge power. And when I hear, for example, from friends in Germany and in England who are good Christians who say that they can't support the boycott of Israel because they just feel too guilty as Christians for doing this, I say, please do not do this to me. And do not grant me this much power. If you were to be my friend, boycott the hell out of Israel. Save us, right? So here again, the Jews. It's the classic. It's the other side of the coin. It's the classic Jewish, the ugliest Jewish anti-Jewish tropes from the ages. The Jews with their money control the banks, the media, the governments, the international corporations. This is classic anti-Semitism on steroids. It's alive and well as a new costume. Does it scare me as a Jew? You bet it does. Did it scare you as Christians, Canadians, U.S. citizens who believe in a whole different set of values, a whole different way of looking at the world? Yes, it should. Real anti-Semitism The toxic anti-Judaism that sprang up in the church sometime after the Constantinian embrace of Christianity is bound up with Christian triumphalism. It emerged as a byproduct and tool of the notion that the faith was the only truth. We talked about it. It was part and parcel of an overarching imperial ideology that granted permission for one people, nationality, or religious institution, or take your pick more commonly, one that combines nationalism and religion, to enslave, oppress, or annihilate those perceived as inferior, and even subhuman. That's what this is about. So we're back to the church struggle, all the way back to the gospel message. The other thing about the new anti-Semitism is that it, again, takes us to the alliance with power. Cry anti-Semitism. So that's what support for Israel means today. If you cry anti-Semitism, you're not defending the Jewish people. By conflating the Jewish people with the state of Israel and Judaism with Zionism, you're defending the global domination system. You're not opposing racism, you're promoting it. You're not fighting fascism, you're advancing. So you see, this is much bigger than Palestine. This is really about the crisis that's facing the world today. That's how we have to take on and understand the question of anti-Semitism. Next slide, please. So again, I was just looking over my John DeGrucci files. He did a homily years ago on this text. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is not John. This is me. Because I want to talk about Kairos theology. So you know that in the Greek, where it says time, the word in Greek is Kairos. And Kairos is one Greek word which is usually translated as time, but there's a whole other Greek word which is chronos, which is what we think about as chronological time. Kairos is, in the words of the South Africans, again, the moment of grace and opportunity when God issues a challenge for decisive action. It's like when Jesus is plopped down in Roman-occupied Palestine. There was a reason that that's when he makes his appearance. And when he unfurls that scroll of Isaiah, he's saying, we have to take, and when he stands in front of the temple and says, bring it down, he is making a very, very political statements, and he's organizing a grassroots movement of resistance. Next slide, please. I understand we have that. I'll tell you that your country and your struggle is very important to me, and I was introduced to you, really, by the Palestinians, who in 2009 wrote their own Kairos document, and the not well-kept secret is that there were some South Africans who were very involved in helping them write that. For any of you who have not read the South Africa Kairos document of 1985, do not wait. Google it, read it. Actually, I have a link to give you. Because alongside the letter from Birmingham jail, it is maybe the towering document of public and textual theology of the 20th century. It's amazing. And it reads very, 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 it's very, very relevant to today. Now, this was a document that basically called for the downfall of the government of South Africa. It comes right out with it. But it is embedded in a brilliant social and theological analysis of the situation in South Africa of the day. And it doesn't, but it's not directed to the Pretoria government. It's a challenge to the church. It was an indication of the church struggle within itself to be in Bonhoeffer's terms, the true church, not the false church. to experience costly grace, not cheap grace. Crisis is a moment of truth that shows us up for what we really are. No place to hide. Just a brief from the Moment of Truth Kairos document of 2009, the Palestinian document, which you also need to read. Again, it's a towering piece of contextual theology, as well as a desperate plea to the world, and in particular to the churches, to recognize what's really going on and to stand with the Palestinians. And it takes, for those of you who've got questions about the Old Testament, it takes direct aim at the Old Testament, and it says it's being used as a weapon against us. That's true. And you know what? It does not make you a supersessionist. It does not make you anti-Semitic to take a look at the Old Testament and say, yeah, well, maybe we did need a Jew to come along and say, yes, this and not this. Well, and in fact, I mean, back to that first line in that last slide, theology is only theology when it is done in direct confrontation and dialogue with history, meaning the present moment. Theology is not static. It's not stuck somewhere else in the past. It's not stuck somewhere up high. You do theology in confrontation with the world that you meet. Also, for you, Mennonites, I just want to throw this in. Elena Weir has done wonderful work, particularly drawing on the work of Yoder. Now, it's a whole other thing. I mean, I have some problems with Yoder. I think a good part of him, he's also stuck in this Philo-Judaic glorification and passion for all things Jewish that clouds him a little bit. I think it holds him back a little bit. Weaver, I don't think, suffers from that so much. And what I like about him is that he takes on supersessionism directly and says, if you critique Zionism, you don't have to be a supersessionist. It's really important for a prominent Christian theologian to do this, especially a Mennonite, I think, because I understand you've got your own sort of cross to bear about Mennonite anti-Semitism. Again, product of history, product of trauma. It's fascinating. I'm just starting to learn about it now. But he is also trying to separate that. Let's take a look at that last bullet. He's trying to separate religion and religious identity from nationalism, from place, from sectarianism, from being particularly enclosed in some sort of group identity, which is connected with us and them. And so he has this idea of diaspora, which I think is he shares with other contemporary theologians, many of them Jewish, who are talking about diaspora as not that you've been exiled and you need to get to where you came from, or you need to be focused on a central place. Where I was taught growing up that I was a diaspora Jew, which means that I should be in Israel, but I'm not. I have to be a little bit apologetic about that, but I have to really support Israel and the whole idea of it. And there's a lot of thinking going on now saying, what does it mean to be diasporic? I think it's an unfortunate term because it implies that you're in diaspora from somewhere. And the whole idea is to get rid of the idea of somewhere and embrace the idea of everywhere. So I just wanted to throw this in. Weaver's done some wonderful work. He wrote a very nice paper, which you can find, but he also wrote several books, and this is a good one. I just don't like the idea of exile. Exile from what? Okay, next slide, please. So, again, I think you can probably just click on any of these links right now and bring them up, but you'll have this slide. and again, this is just a selection, but these are, I think, foundational texts for you all. So there's the South African Kairos document. There's the Palestinian Kairos document. Now, the 2009 Palestinian document spawned a whole network, a whole range of responses to that document. So you have from Brazil, you have from Germany, you have from the UK, you have from South Africa, you have from South Korea, you have from United States, you have from Canada. Don't think there's a Canadian one. But the Kairos USA one, I think, is very good, and it's a confession as well of our own culpability. I should have it in here. The Brits wrote a terrific one too. There's a UK Kairos document. They're all very, 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 very good public theology. They are a direct response to Palestine. Palestine becomes a springboard for doing the theology that needs to be done. The Filipinos did an amazing Kairos document. And I can include this, a list, a place to go to find them. Actually, you can find all of them if you go to kairosusa.org. And there's a page where you can find them all. And I wrote some papers too, which you're welcome to read, and I can have Steve send them to you. Palestine Portal is a program of Kairos USA, which is a lot of the work that I've been doing over the past 20 years. And it's a very, very rich source of all of this stuff. I talked about ChristianZionism.org. Canadian Friends of Sabeel is, I think, the Canadian version of a lot of what you see under here when I talk about USA and Canada. These are all, PIN means Palestine Israel Network. So the peace churches and the major mainline denominations in the United States have been doing a lot of work over the past 20 years in mobilizing their churches. They like to say they don't speak for the church, they speak to the church. This UCC pin, that UCC is the United Church of Christ. It's a Congregational Church in America. It's not the United Church of Canada. I looked up the United Church of Canada website for Palestine, Israel. It's okay, but there needs to be. You need to push them a little farther. They're calling for ceasefire. They're calling for humanitarian aid, but they are not getting to the heart of the matter. What you see now with some of the United States denominations and some European churches as well is they are calling shenanigans on Christian Zionism. They're saying we disavow it. They are saying Israel is an apartheid state, and they're even using the G word. They're even talking about genocide. So they're making a lot of progress. They haven't yet taken a stand in terms of any kind of real action to push their governments to do anything. I mean, take a look at our government. Nowhere on that. But what I'm saying is the theology is being done. And that's the answer to the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And I think we're there. What's the next slide? Yeah. I mean, I was fooling around here and thinking, what's a list of things that need to be done? It's really just, I think, the beginning in terms of working at the grassroots. I think building coalitions. One thing, and I really will end here, one thing that I feel really needs to happen is, okay, my story, my position in terms of organizing is that the churches are key. And I mean a global church network operating at the grassroots, at local, congregational, national, denominational, and ecumenical levels. Because I think the church has a good history of this in terms of its struggle. I think of the confessing church, which of course was crushed, but it was important, and it became the basis of the ecumenical movement that grew up after the interruption of World War II. There is a civil rights movement in the United States, which started in the basement of a church in Birmingham, Alabama, in Montgomery, Alabama. And the whole grassroots organizing strategy, read the letter from Birmingham jail, was from the Gospels. That was the blueprint. Enormously powerful, and it took over the whole society. It started in the churches, and the leaders were pastors. Take a look at the anti-apartheid movement. Okay, the South Africans will tell you that they could not have brought down apartheid without the support of the outside world. And a big part of that was when the World Alliance of Reformed Churches in 1982 officially kicked out the churches in South Africa which were practicing apartheid and separation. And the rest of the world just piled on. I have South African friends who said they were sending so much money. Actually, it ended up not being good for us. But it was a huge piece of the success of the anti-apartheid movement. It was the churches. What's not happening is that nobody's connecting the dots between other liberation movements, other resistance movements, both locally within countries and internationally, and the work that the churches are doing. Those dots have not been connected. When I talk about the churches to non-church audiences, they have no idea about this. And those are powerful, powerful stories. And those stories need to be told, and the churches need to be mobilized. I think it's the key. So I will stop here. We've had hopefully time for a couple of questions.
Sure. Oh, gosh, Mark, thank you so much. Absolutely beautiful. Yeah, amazing. We want to create a little space here for any further questions or reflections people have. Give it a few minutes, people, as you cultivate things. Sorry, my brain is so tired. It's 2:00. Speaking of South Africa, it's 2:00 in the morning, South Africa. But we're so happy to be here. Any questions for Mark as we come to a close here today? Well, I mean, I thought you said something very powerful. You mentioned, just as kind of a byline, you said theology is only theology when it's embedded in history. Thought that was such a profound reminder and realization of how much our theological imaginations have to be grounded in what's happening around us constantly. I just wondered, Mark, if you could give us a few more words around
Right.
what does it mean for theology to really be grounded in history? Because I think sometimes we conceptually think of theology as these things out there, as the way we do biblical. We exegete all kinds of stuff and think about all this stuff, and it's only the rare occasion where it really kind of trickles down, maybe into some ethics or into some moral ways of being in the world. What does it mean for theology?
Yeah, good question, Stephen. I think I think embedded is not the word I use. I think I used about confronting history. And I think about the church is only the church when it is confronting history. And Bonhoeffer talked about the real church is the church from below. So it's good liberation theology, right? So a couple of things about nomenclature. For one thing, when I first started to learn and study liberation theology, which started, Latin America, now there's liberation theology happening wherever people are struggling. Howard Thurman, who was a great African-American theologian who was a mentor of Martin Luther King Jr., said that theology is really done by those with their backs against the wall. Right? So in fact, it's very powerful stuff. Read Jesus and the Dispossessed. Jesus and the Disinherited. Howard Thurman, Thurman. Slim book. You've also got a South African guy, John senior moment, who was a disciple of his, but got wonderful. He wrote about Jesus before Christianity. John, there comes to me. He was a Dominican. He just died recently. So when I first read liberation theology, I thought, well, why do they call it liberation theology? It sounds like that's theology. You don't need the descriptor. And theology itself, I think, can be an unfortunate phrase and a misnomer, because what does it mean? It means the study of God, right? How to know God, right? Theology is not a study of God as if we can trying to understand God. We can't understand God. God is God. To me, theology is the study of what it is that God expects of us. It's about human action in history, in human affairs. And as you said, we tend to think of theology as being about God, about something above, and about something non-terrestrial, non-temporal, and it's just the opposite. So I like the expression "doing theology." If you're not doing it, then it's not theology. And I love theology. In another lifetime, I would have been a theologian. Some people say I am. So, you're right. We get it confused with theism and God and, quote, faith and belief has to be active. That's it. And we have to listen to the voices. I was having a conversation with Alan Busak once and said, Alan, I keep coming across this Latin phrase, vox victimarum, vox Dei. The voice of God is the voice of the victim. The voice of the victims is the voice of God. And hey, this is Jesus, right? Jesus in the last chapter of Luke, right? Jesus has been crucified, tomb's empty, they don't know what's going on. The women, he makes these appearances on the road to Emmaus, and the women say they've seen him. He turns up in Jerusalem. I guess it was already after Pentecost. And he turns up, and they don't recognize him. They thought he'd seen a ghost, right? And what does Jesus say to them? He says, after 3 years, you still don't get it. You still don't recognize me. And what my thing is about? He says, look at my wounds. I have humanity. I'm suffering humanity. These are the marks of oppression. These are the marks of the tyranny. This is the marks of suffering and oppression. And he says, you got something to eat? People right? So when people say Jesus is God, yeah, that's God speaking. He takes human form. And he suffers. That's the voice.
Man, absolutely beautiful. And we find ourselves, I think, in a world right now where God is speaking all the time in the lives of those who, all right. We see the crucified God in too many places these days. But Mark, I want to thank you very much for evoking us, drawing us into this conversation today, tonight, this morning, wherever we happen to be. Find it both very challenging, very thought-provoking, and deeply encouraging to, again, reconnect the story of God in our lives to the reality of suffering in the world, and to be mindful of the ways in which also suffering and trauma can become modes of weaponization against others, and the frameworks by which we try to navigate this world in humility and love, and in the power of possibilities when we come together. So thank you very much for spending time with us tonight. I think there's some word on the street that you may be teaching a course at SSU in the summer for our summer school coming up. And so if that comes to fruition fully, I'm in. That sounds so fun. So, thank you for being with us, Lauren. Good to see your face. We're going to close off our conversation. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Thank you for giving some of your time and energy. I hope that it was meaningful for you as well. As we go to close, I'm going to play another video just to speak a little bit more about SSU and who we are, what we do, courses that we have available, which you can always find at St. Stephen's Universe at ssu.ca. But again, thank you for being with us, and I hope you have a beautiful rest of the day. Cheers.
My name's Virginia Lindsay, and I'm from Stony Brook, New York. I chose to enroll in SSU's MA in Peace and Justice program because it combined a lot of niche things that I was looking for and interested in. I couldn't find this combination of peace building, conflict transformation, theology, particularly public theology. And also I was interested in incorporating more of a contemplative practice into my own personal life. So I couldn't believe it when I found SSU's program, which really gave me all of those things at once. One of the things that makes SSU really unique is that they offer inner transformation when it comes to peace building and conflict transformation, which is pretty rare and such a need. You can only give what you have inside of you. There's, for obvious reasons, a lot of burnout in the field, so learning tools to maintain one's inner peace so that you can keep giving it away is important. Now I feel more equipped to enter into my vocation as a peace builder than I would have just studying the science of it by itself. I was really surprised at how personal this trip became. In this season of life, my prayer has been, Lord, make me whole so I can give wholeness away. And I have to say that after this experience in Northern Ireland, I think that's true, and I'm ready.